Hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes. Here are the three big stories for today. Okay, so the first is that the Republican convention just started yesterday, and I'm recording this before the main events of the Republican convention tonight because those are in like prime time hours. So I'm giving you some of what happened yesterday. So, Republicans to Putin, we're done with Ukraine. According to the Bulwark, that's the headline. The Bulwark is like the never Trumpers, and some uh, some people that are on the left that don't like Trump. Many of them are from the right that don't like Trump. That's the headline. Vance was just nominated or was just put forward as the vice presidential candidate to run with Trump. The balance of power within the GOP has shifted. This is now an isolationist party. Now, again, I told you about who the Bulwark is because of their bias. I don't know that it is an isolationist party in the sense that they're shifting. They're not isolationists. They're shifting their attention from Europe to China. But okay, and if Republicans win this year's presidential election, the first victim of this retreat in the world will be Ukraine. I think that's very fair, or could be very fair. Vance was by far the most anti-Ukraine candidate on Trump's vice presidential shortlist. As a senator, he fought against aid to Ukraine and has made clear that he isn't particularly interested in defending Europe. 2 years ago, shortly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Vance shrugged, "I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other." The convention's organizers gave a coveted evening speaking slot to Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. So that's telling you where they're going. And they're doubling down on being not just anti-Ukraine, being pro-MAGA in all of MAGA's manifestations. In his own primetime address, tech investor and CEO David Sachs went further. He blamed President Biden for Russia's invasion. And then Sachs also boasted that Trump, unlike Biden, would be a president who understands that you build the most powerful military in the world to keep America safe, not to play the world's policeman. A president who is willing to talk to its adversaries as well as friends because that's the only way to make peace. A president who will stand up to the warmongers instead of empowering them. And by warmongers, he means war hawks in the United States, not Putin. Like that's what he's actually saying there. A president who is willing to talk to adversaries was an obvious allusion to Putin. Here's David Sachs, and nothing good is going to come out of his mouth when he starts speaking. He's all in on the isolationist, pro-peace at any price, pro-Putin, anti-Ukraine kind of agenda. Here's his speech at the Republican National Convention yesterday. The only thing that I can say about this is at least he wasn't getting a rousing ovation for his speech.
Getting off the worst inflation since Jimmy Carter. But worst of all, the Biden-Harris administration has taken a world that was at peace under President Trump, and they lit it on fire.
Yeah, they're not exactly excited
First,
out in the stands.
President Biden botched the Afghanistan withdrawal, displaying incompetence and weakness for the whole world to see. Then, he provoked the Russians to invade Ukraine with talk of NATO expansion.
Okay, did you hear what he said there? He blamed Biden for provoking Putin to invade Ukraine, as if Putin wasn't, going to do that on his own or wasn't interested in recapturing former glory of Russia. There's mild clapping, not really a groundswell.
He rejected every opportunity for peace in Ukraine, including a deal to end the war just 2 months after it broke out. Now the war is deep.
Again, the crowd is less than enthusiastic, but they're like, okay, whatever.
Into its third year with no end in sight. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Hundreds of billions of our taxpayer dollars have gone up in smoke. President Biden sold us this new forever war by promising it would weaken Russia and strengthen America. Well, how does that look today? Russia's military is bigger than before, while our own stockpiles are dangerously depleted.
Okay, so we can challenge this, but that Russia is bigger than before, that sort of thing. Russia has been depleted significantly as well, and it's come at a very small cost to the United States in our stockpiles or our budgets.
There are new
and no
calls for
lives.
escalation, and the world looks on in horror as Joe Biden's demented policy takes us to the brink of World War III.
Notice he's saying that by supporting Ukraine, you're more likely to get to World War III. And you can hear this constantly, this refrain about that within MAGA kind of circles. So then he pivots and goes on to talk about other things. But that's what I wanted you to hear about that speech on the floor of the convention yesterday. It's chilling. Here's an article in CNBC, God Help Ukraine, how J.D. Vance's VP nomination will cause chills in Kyiv. Ohio Republican Vance is a staunch proponent of Trump's America First policy and is ambivalent over U.S. intervention in foreign affairs. He has strongly opposed more aid for Ukraine and has suggested Kyiv be prepared to cede territory to Russia in order to achieve peace. Vance has argued that the U.S. should encourage Ukraine to strike a peace deal with Russia and that Kyiv should be prepared to cede land to its invader. That's not cool. What is Russia actually ceding in this? Ceding, stopping the violence? Is that what Russia's going to give up in this? It ends the way nearly every single war has ever ended. When people negotiate, each side gives up something that it doesn't want to give up, Vance told reporters in December, adding, "No one can explain to me how this ends without some territorial concessions relative to the 1991 boundaries." Wow. So that's a really bad look. Like to tap Vance, who holds these positions, is just it's terrible. He also echoed Trumpian view that NATO members in the region were not spending enough on defense, a valid accusation in the past, analysts say. However, the record is getting better. NATO last week said 23 out of 32. That's about 2/3 of the allies are now meeting 2% gross, which is still not going to be really moving the needle like it needs to be moving the needle, where the U.S. isolationists go, Europe is stepping up, because they haven't really proven that yet. The United States has provided blanket of security to Europe for far too long, Vance wrote in FT. As the American defense budget nears $1 trillion per year, we ought to view the money Europe hasn't spent on defense for what it really is, an implied tax on the American people to allow for the security of Europe. Now, he's making a legitimate point. Now might not be the time to be doing that while Ukraine is struggling to fight off invasion from an authoritarian neighbor. So Vance was a terrible pick in my estimation, but here's why he was picked. This is the United States map. There are 50 states, as you know, and there are only about 6 states that will determine the election. And that's because some states, like California, are going to be reliably blue, and other states, like Texas, are going to be reliably red. That's Democrat and Republican, respectively. Now, these swing states are going to make the difference. J.D. Vance happens to be from Ohio, so he can speak Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin-like Midwest values as he's trying to speak to that audience. And so that the calculation, I think, is both to double down on MAGA and to give the greatest chance of winning these states. Yesterday, I talked about this, about how Vance was the likely nominee, but I was hoping it would be Burgum or Rubio, and no such luck. Vance did get the nomination. Now, let's turn our attention over to the UK for just a moment, and then we'll come back to something. The UK and its allies face deadly quartet of nations, defense expert says. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea increasingly acting together against the West, according to a defense review chief. So this defense review chief, his name is George Robertson, a former NATO Secretary General, said that the UK had to be prepared to take on all 4 if necessary, reflecting Western concerns that the grouping are increasingly sharing arms, components, and military intelligence. They are. Flanked by the new Defense Secretary, John Healey, Lord Robertson told a briefing that we're confronted by a deadly quartet of nations increasingly working together, and then Britain and its allies have got to be able to confront that particular quartet. Okay, now with that, I just saw this today. U.S. believes Russia is passing U.S. weapons data to China. Now remember, the U.S., one of the reasons that the U.S. is saying, look, can't be all in on Ukraine is because we have to keep our eye on what's going on with China. Well, this is bad. The congressmen cite media reports and think tanks about China's support for Russia's military industry and, quote, an alarming level of Russian adaptation, unquote, that has undermined the effectiveness of several unnamed U.S. weapon systems. Because sharing that information with the Chinese can then get back to the Russians. Theoretically, we can't prove this yet, but the Chinese can then help the Russians be able to defeat these weapon systems. So that's what's going on potentially there. Meanwhile, this was RT. Zelensky says he's not afraid of Trump presidency. Quote, we have a strong relationship with the Republican side of Congress and the U.S. political class, the Ukrainian leader said during a news conference on Monday when asked about the U.S. election campaign. He pointed to his meetings with the GOP, that's Grand Old Party, that means the Republican Party, members last week when he traveled to the U.S. to sign the Ukraine Compact, a multinational pledge of long-term support for Kyiv against Moscow. Zelensky mentioned the $40 billion, it was actually I think $43 billion, in aid that the U.S. and its allies pledged to Ukraine last week and suggested that Trump would be happy about the arrangement because 3/4 of the money will come from Europe and not the U.S. And even if the U.S. were to pull out of it, that means there's 30 some odd billion dollars that is going to be still going to Ukraine next year, guaranteed through this NATO arrangement. So my thoughts about this, I posted this in the community tab last night. Thoughts about the first day of the Republican National Convention. Dana Perino, former White House secretary, Fox News commentator, was just talking about a massive political realignment, and she may be right, alas. Now, that political alignment, Trump is trying to talk to younger voters and minority voters and things where he's actually making some headway, chipping away at what is democratically generally a stronghold. Now, that might be the case. It looks like there is some shifting. The isolationism comes with that, unfortunately. I said I've never been less excited about this in my life, this meaning the Republican convention. Vance was a terrible pick. Trump doubled down on MAGA with this pick, ignoring my wing of the party. That is the Reagan conservatives that used to be dominant in the Republican Party until the emergence of Trump. It will likely hurt Ukraine. I believe that that's the case. It is probable that a Trump presidency would hurt Ukraine more than help Ukraine. Trump was sitting one person away from Tucker Carlson, and only Byron Donaldson, the representative from Florida, was sitting between them. Here's the part of the analysis you're really not going to like. I believe Trump is more likely to win than he was 54 hours ago, before he was shot and before 2 weeks ago, Biden's debate performance. I think that's true. I think he's more likely to win, and I'll explain why in just a moment. I also believe that the Democrats have one opportunity to do something to prevent Trump, and that will require replacing Biden, who Trump actually wants to run against. There are Republicans who are now preparing lawsuits in case Biden drops out because they want to run against Biden because they think that he's that weak. So if you're not going to get Trump, Biden has to drop, and you need to find an alternative before the convention closes next month, Democrats. Like that's really what this amounts to in my estimation. I could be wrong, but this is how I perceive it. Based on the comments I'm reading on YouTube and Twitter, my conversation with Vlad Vexler, recorded yesterday and released today, could not be more important for the way that we talk about politics moving forward. And that I'm talking about this video, Why Civil Discourse Goes Wrong. And please check that out. It was great. What a great conversation we had yesterday. Okay, now I told you that I think that Trump is actually poised to win. Now, there's a long time between now and November, so things could change. But I was watching CNN last night. I flipped between channels, between Fox, CNN, and NBC, so I can understand like the different perspectives. On CNN, I think it was Wolf Blitzer who was at the map showing how Trump is poised to win Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia if the election were held today. And that, again, that's a caveat. Probably Nevada and or Arizona. And he said that the path for Biden to win is increasingly narrowing. Things could change between now and the election, of course, but where it stands right now, it's not looking good for the Democrats, and by extension, it's not looking good for Ukraine when Trump picked Vance, who has been pretty anti-Ukraine. So tell me what you thought about that. Put it in the comments below. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.